Hello friends, welcome to my living room here in Tegama. Greetings on this 24th day of our confinement, and I just took a picture from the balcony, our kitchen balcony, so you can see that spring is beginning to show itself, as it probably is where you are, and the trees are starting to show green. And also the virus continues its advance and also its prominence in the news, with about 80,000 people who have died officially from the virus. But we need to remember that many others, far more than that number, have died from other reasons that happen, I guess you could say, routinely, and we don't know much about them. So let's keep our focus on, Lord, how can I love you today and serve you in the best way? That's our goal, no matter where we are, no matter what we're doing. And so today I'd like to look at the man Job. Not an easy one to do because of the subject matter. It's a very special story, that of Job. But I want to read some verses and then make some observations that I hope will be a blessing and a challenge. Job 1:5, and it was so when the days of their feasting were gone about, that's his children, that Job sent and sanctified them and rose up early in the morning and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all, for each one of them. For Job said, it may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus did Job continually, very disciplined and very family conscious. Loved his family very much. In chapter 2, verse 7-8, so went Satan forth from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot unto his crown. And he took him a potsherd to scrape himself withal, and he sat down among the ashes. A very pathetic scene. And when they lifted up their eyes, these are his three friends afar off, and knew him not, they didn't recognize him, they lifted up their voice and wept. And they rent every one his mantle and sprinkled dust upon their heads toward heaven. These were customs of those days. So they sat down with him upon the ground 7 days and 7 nights. And none spake a word unto him. Very interesting, for they saw that his grief was very great. And then, in chapter 19, just describing a little bit his confinement or isolation, I guess, from others, just a part of this passage where it says, he hath put my brethren far from me, and mine acquaintance are verily estranged from me. Everybody's left me. My kinsfolk have failed, and my familiar friends have forgotten me. They that dwell in mine house and my maids count me for a stranger. I am an alien in their sight. And so I hope you know the story of Job, because there's a lot more to it than what I just read, of course. A very unusual kind of quarantine, isolation, or confinement thing brought on by a very strange situation that didn't happen on earth, it happened in heaven. It was a conversation between God and Satan. He was a real character, obviously. Like Jonah the other day we saw, he's mentioned by Ezekiel, mentioned by James. Paul mentions him in Romans and in Corinthians. And there was no doubt it is exactly who the Bible says he was. He was a godly man, as we saw, prayed specifically for each one of his children every day. So he loved his family. Who authored the book? That's a good question. Probably not Job, just because of the perspective from which it's written. The main proponents, or the main candidates, I guess would say, are Moses, pretty good candidate, or maybe Solomon, who wrote the rest of the poetical books of the Bible. But anyway, we don't know who wrote it exactly. It's a unique book because the characters in the book don't have the privileged knowledge, or the knowledge that we have as a reader. We know from the very beginning what was going on. They had no idea. They had no idea. In fact, well, we'll see more of that in just a few minutes. Okay, so let's look at the friends. Okay, the friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. At least that's the way I pronounce them. And Elihu. And I have a question mark behind Elihu. I don't know if he was a friend or not. Maybe you could consider him a friend. He wasn't called one. Well, I don't know. Anyway, none of them knew. None of these, Job or these four, nobody had any idea that God and Satan had this conversation. And God is showing us how life is. There is much more to life than what we see. Way more. And that's why it makes sense. Because many times life does not make sense from our perspective. And it definitely didn't to Job. Okay, so just a few things. I'm going to give some quotations from the friends. There's no way we can do a thorough study of the book, so I just pull out a couple. Eliphaz, the first one. He was well-meaning, and he was the most sensitive and thoughtful of the three friends. He said in chapter 5, verse 17, "Behold, happy is the man whom God correcteth. Therefore despise not thou the chastening of the Almighty." That's a good statement, and we'll see that the friends often gave correct information. Whether it was appropriate is another question, but that what he said was definitely good. In chapter 22 he says, "For then thou shalt have thy delight in the Almighty, and shalt lift up thy face unto God." And he speaks here very clearly of a personal, happy relationship with Almighty God. That's Eliphaz. He speaks 3 times. Bildad also speaks 3 times, but he is much harsher, much more dogmatic, and he is sure that Job is hiding something. And we can think of people, maybe ourselves, when we have had this kind of attitude towards someone else who is going through rough circumstances. In chapter 8 he said, "If thy children have sinned against him, and he have cast them away for their transgression," I mean, he's like basically saying, hey, they deserved it. In chapter 18, "How long will it be ere you make an end of words? Mark, listen, and afterwards we will speak. Wherefore are we counted as beasts and reputed vile in your sight?" Bildad's not a very friendly guy, and he's not diplomatic in any way. And then Zophar only speaks twice, and he is also quite condemning, like Bildad. And he only speaks twice. Maybe he gave up Job for useless. He said, this is waste of time. I'm not going to say anything else. I don't know. We don't have that information. He said at one point, "The increase of his house shall depart, and his goods shall flow away in the day of his wrath." This is the evil person. "This is the portion of a wicked man from God, and the heritage appointed unto him by God." Well, Job had just lost everything, so, put 2 and 2 together. Who's he talking about? So those are the friends, quote unquote. They were friends. They showed that they were friends at the beginning, but they weren't perhaps the wisest, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And then there's that 4th guy, Elihu. Elihu, as best we can tell and what appears, he was young, eloquent, but arrogant and condescending. And interestingly, to me anyway, God completely ignores him. In the book, or in the writing, God makes absolutely no mention of this guy. He shows up, I think it's 4 chapters, blurts out a whole bunch of stuff, highfalutin stuff, and then he's gone. He says, "Behold, I am according to thy wish in God's stead. I am also formed out of the clay. Behold, my terror shall not make thee afraid, neither shall my hand be heavy upon thee." He comes across as, I'm just like you, this, that, and the other. But then, man, he lights into him. So he starts off with this nice conversation that sort of looks, I'm your buddy, but then he really changes his tune. Later on he says, "Therefore doth Job open his mouth in vain, he multiplieth words without knowledge." In other words, Job is ignorant And so those are the four guys. A few lessons from the guys, or observations. First, there is no word of prayer for Job. No word of prayer for Job. In fact, there's no word of anybody praying for Job. It says that they sat down for 7 days and 7 nights, and they didn't say a word. There's no word of prayer there. And then, although sometimes these friends were dead wrong in what they said, totally wrong. At other times, they said the right thing. I mean, it was correct what they said. But it was out of context or inappropriate for the occasion. It wasn't the right thing to say at that time to someone who was suffering like Job. So, it's so important to be a good friend to one who suffers. It is so important. But it's also so easy to ruin that friendship with the wrong words. So it's so important to be careful with what we say to those who are going through a tremendously difficult time. Okay, let's move on from the friends and go to God. When God comes in and speaks in chapter 38, 39, this has always caught my attention. God comes in like a tornado with a whirlwind. I mean, bam, he's there and everything's flying, and there he is. And he doesn't say, oh, you poor thing, I've been trying you. I know you've had it rough. Not a word of pity. Not one word of sympathy. Very interesting. That's what it is. That's what it says. And then I started counting the questions. It got a little complicated, so I just Googled it, and more or less, there are 77 questions that the Lord fires at them like out of a machine gun in 2 chapters. On cosmology, oceanography, meteorology, and astronomy, and a couple of other onomies probably. So he's just firing questions at Job that Job can't really answer. And get this, God never once mentions his suffering in the book of Job. Never once does he even mention Job's suffering. Wow. That is very significant. Another thing, it doesn't appear that God gave Job special grace for the trial. He didn't give him special grace, at least as I would understand it, that we would pray for, perhaps. God never tells Job why the trial. We know why, in a sense, but Job didn't. And recently, in recent years, I've lost some friends myself, friends that went to school with me or that are my age in the ministry, friends who were preaching and faithful to God, and they've gone through tremendous suffering, and some of them have died through it. And right now, a friend, his name is Daniel Garlick, is extremely deathly sick. And we're not close friends, but I've only met him once years ago, but great man, great ministry and family, and God has him going through a tremendous difficulty, a tremendous sickness, and I'm thinking, Lord, why? Why him? Why that way? Why not me? And so, serious questions. You may never know in this life why you've suffered as you have. There may never be anything close to a clear reason, and there fits perfectly with the pattern we have in Job's situation. Another thing, God ignores. He not only ignores Elihu, he ignores Satan after the opening of the book. He never mentions Satan again. In the last chapter, not a peep, not a word. It's not about Satan. It's about God and His sovereign, perfect will. That's what it's about. Interesting that He leaves Satan out of it completely. And so, with care and caution and respect, I say one of the most important issues in suffering is to watch the attitude. To watch the attitude. As I suffer, as you suffer, what's your attitude? Will we lift our fist when it comes, or bow our head? Two opposing responses, opposites. And the question to ask would, with the suffering that has come to me, which may be very light compared to Job or to some other friends. There's many different kinds of suffering. We're not going to get into that. But with the suffering that has come to me, how have I responded? With my fist or with a bowed heart? Very important. Job 1:20. Well, I actually have it here. I'll just read it from here. Then Job arose and rent his mantle and shaved his head and fell down upon the ground and worshipped. Which response is that? We know, right? And said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. And we can say that maybe through the process of the debate with his friends bringing in their boiling accusations and so forth, Job got out of line a few times and snapped back and responded poorly, maybe so, but this was his general attitude. That's the way it started, and it's the way he ended. So it's very important. Take away for those with friends who are suffering, how to help them. I think the best thing we can do is pray. Pray for grace. What does that mean? I would say at least it means to pray that God would give them wisdom and strength. Wisdom and strength. The book ends, as you probably well know, with the words, after this lived Job 140 years and saw his sons and his sons' sons, even 4 generations. So that gives us a good idea of how old he was. So Job died, being old and full of days, which basically means he died happy. The story does end well. God shows Job that he loves him, he values him, he was generous with Job, and he died happy. The last chapter is always good for the believer. It may just not start before death, but that last chapter will always be wonderful. May God give us grace in our suffering, and may He make us or help us to be good friends to those who are suffering. God bless you. Have a great day. See you next time.